8. Limited liability and unlimited money. In the middle of the 19th century, liberal regimes in England passed legislation which was designed to suit the convenience of various elements of the commercial community. Joint stock companies were given the privilege of limited liability. Arthur Bryant has called attention to the implications of this step. Up to this time, a man's power to make money by transferring his credit and freedom of commercial action to others was restrained by his liability for the obligations they might incur. This check on irresponsible delegation was now removed. A man could grow rich in security and even innocence from business practices which would have outraged his conscience as an individual. He could avoid both the risks and stigma of transactions done by others in pursuit of profits which he shared. At first, Bryant points out, the investing public was slow in taking advantage of the Act. After the failure of the City of Glasgow Bank in 1879, many shareholders were required to meet financial obligations, hundreds of times greater than the value of their shares. This started a trend to limited liability concerns, which became marked in the last 8 years of the century. As Bryant observed, the consequences of the Companies Act of 1862 were perhaps greater than that of any single measure in English parliamentary history. They completed the divorce between the Christian conscience and the economic practice of everyday life. They paganized the commercial community. Henceforward, an astute man, by adherence to legal rules which had nothing to do with morality, could grow immensely rich by virtue of shuffling off his most elementary obligations to his fellows. He could not only grow rich by such means, he could grow immensely rich. The rise of limited liability companies created a new managerial aristocracy. It also established a sharp and hard division between employer and employee. Again, Bryant's discerning analysis needs citing. By directing money into enterprises designed not so much for stable long-term production as for quick capital appreciation, the new financier tended to make industrial employment even more precarious than it had been before. Mushroom companies sprang up in all directions to initiate or develop industrial processes which could have little or no enduring future. This directly affected the working man and his social background. More than ever, his job and home became dependent on circumstances beyond his control. As an individual, he became more and more helpless. The stimulus to joint stock manufacturing and trading afforded by the principle of limited liability had another fatal consequence on the life of the working man. Under laissez-faire individualism, it at least paid to be efficient. The workman, who by his skill in industry furthered the interests of his employer, had a reasonable chance of promotion, for he was too valuable to lose. But when the control of business passed out of the hands of the private employer using his own capital into that of the financial company representing an intangible mass of absentee shareholders without active knowledge of its affairs, the industrious workman found it increasingly difficult to better himself. His efficiency and steadfastness had no value to directors, whose only aim was to sell a concern that employed him at an inflated value. In any case, he was less likely to be noticed by managers whose stake in the business was confined to salaries paid them by the shareholders and who were not personally interested in its successes. Thus, the conscientious workman was increasingly discouraged. The man with ambition and intelligence, instead of identifying himself with the industrial system of which he was a part, was driven to rebel against it. Instead of becoming a small capitalist, he became a socialist. Adam Smith had always maintained that manufacturing by joint stock companies must prove injurious to the public interest. He argued that efficiency and consequently wealth resulted from every man attending scrupulously to his own self-interest. Such attention could not be successfully delegated. Very early in the history of the United States, some states made legal the limited liability company, but such concerns were not too commonly established. They were regarded as essentially irresponsible, and they failed to attract capital. After the Civil War, the moral and industrial climate changed, and, as in England, such concerns began to succeed. Limited liability did not become legal without extensive opposition. The opponents of limited liability believed that it would in the end destroy capitalism. They believed, in fact, that a principle of responsibility which is basic to free enterprise was at stake in the issue. To understand the nature of their opposition to limited liability, it is important to analyse their arguments. George Sweet, writing in England in 1855 and in part answering John Stuart Mill's objection to the English law which then prohibited partnerships with limited liability to creditors, pointed out that to expect the state to limit liability for trade debts without limiting profits was hardly a valid premise. The prohibition of limited liability placed responsibility where it belonged, both morally and commercially. He who transacts any business on behalf of another, whether avowedly or not, binds his employer by all that he does, while acting in the business confided to him, so that a merchant is answerable even for the fraud of his factor in selling one kind of goods for another. And Lord Chief Justice Holtz gives a sound reason for this. Seeing that someone must be a loser by the deceit, it is more reason that he employs and puts a trust and confidence in the deceiver should be loser than a stranger. Liability is inescapable. By limiting the liability of the company which contracts a debt or permits a fraud, the liability is then passed on to innocent parties. Limited liability thus shifts responsibility away from the responsible to society at large. A partner or shareholder in a company will exercise cautious and conscientious control over its company if his liability for the debts and frauds of that company are not limited to the extent of his investment. The result is sound, moral and careful management of a company by the actual owners. But with limited liability, a premium is placed on profit irrespective of responsibility. The shareholder is less concerned with buying responsible ownership and more concerned with buying a share in profits. And then, as the state further protects the shareholder against liabilities in his irresponsible pursuit of profits, the shareholder becomes less and less concerned with the responsible and moral management of his company. As Sweet noted, with respect to the prohibition of limited liability, what is here called a prohibition is nothing more than a rule of evidence for ascertaining the real debtor, and a rule which solves the problem in the way most satisfactory to the common sense. Sweet, as a barrister at law at the Inner Temple, was especially concerned with the legal and moral anarchy implicit in limited liability. We might add, too, that since limited liability was in effect a state subsidy to commercial firms at the expense of the public, it was inescapable that what the state subsidized, the state would eventually also control. Bramwell and others, in denying that the state had the right to prohibit limited liability, argued on the principle of non-interference, of laissez-faire, certainly a strange application of the idea. Sweet answered that what is called the principle of non-interference, when correctly stated, amounts to no more than this, that unnecessary and mischievous interference with the free agency of subjects is the besetting sin of governments, and should always be held in fear when the property of any particular interference is under discussion. A legal requirement of moral responsibility was not wrong. The proponents of limited liability were for a laissez-faire attitude regarding moral issues. A Gresham's Law factor enters in with their laissez-faire immoralism. Morally bad concerns drive out good ones. So, when a mercantile undertaking is started with a large capital and limited liability, those to whom it offers custom are under duress to deal with it, however much they may dislike the limit of liability. They would prefer the English common law, but finding that limited partnerships obtain credit, they must either go with the stream or retire from business in favour of others more adventurous. The reckless debtor thus creates the reckless trader. The limited liability company has an advantage over the company without such protection. Having limited responsibility for its debts, it is free to take chances which a fully responsible company will not take. The limited liability has state protection in its risk-taking, which the other companies do not have. It is not surprising, therefore, that Sweet's expectations have been fulfilled. Limited liability is now the routine and standard status of business companies. The consequences have been twofold. Previously, the fact of unlimited liability made investors wary of too speculative a company or unwilling to risk too great a debt. True, Hunt reports on the fact that some banks were more ready to extend credit rashly to companies with unlimited liability, thus leading to some overextension. But the problems created by the rashness of some unlimited liability companies were few in contrast to those later created by limited liability companies. The evidence is also strong that both investors and the public, especially in the United States, were usually wary of limited liability companies. The first effect of limited liability was the progressive separation of ownership from responsibility, of management from property. Burnham called it the managerial revolution without analysing its origins in limited liability. Pearl has also described it as a revolution, one in which a group of executives control a corporation whose owners have retained little power over their property. The historic field of responsibility, a group of financially interested stockholders to which each corporate management must account, is progressively being eliminated. Moreover, the rise of the corporate system with attendant separation of ownership from management due to concentration of industry in the corporate form was the first great 20th century change. In 3 decades, it led to the rise of autonomous corporation management. The second tendency, pooling of savings, voluntary or forced in fiduciary institutions, now is steadily separating the owner, if the stockholder can properly be called an owner, from his residual ultimate power, that of voting for management. In effect, this is gradually removing power of selective boards of directors and managements from these managements themselves as self-perpetuating oligarchies to a different and rising group of interests, pension trustees, mutual fund managers, and, less importantly, insurance company managements. These emerging groups are themselves self-perpetuating, though allied to corporate management. They are on the margin of that world, closer to the world of bankers than to the world of production and sales executives. There is a divorce of individuals from economic initiative. There is now power without property, that is, without responsible individual ownership. Persons and organizations other than owners control or manage property. The stockholders, technically owners, have the right to receive only. The condition of their being is that they do not interfere in management. The average quote-unquote conservative, not liking Pearl, tends to reject his argument and call attention to some broad generalizations, Preferring perhaps Roger Blau, they tend to accept his defence of corporations as the more conservative position, but the fact still remains that Adam Smith would not call the present order capitalistic, and it can be argued that the limited liability company destroyed capitalism. Free enterprise requires risk, and the risk is taken by the capitalist, by the entrepreneur. If there is protection from risk, there is protection from freedom, and if the risk is passed on to others at state instigation, it logically follows that the farmer and the working man can claim some form of limited liability from risk, some protection from consequences. Risk is inescapable in any and every society. In a free society, full responsibility is assumed by individuals or associations. It is their duty to protect themselves by prudent measures, and, failing that, to assume the consequences. When the risk is assumed by the states and by society at large, the ultimate failure of the entire order is assured, in that the irresponsibility of all the people is encouraged. Capitalism and limited liability are alien concepts. Second, limited liability has, in the long run, assured a greater readiness by corporations to assume debt. After all, the homes and incomes of those involved are not at stake, but only their limited investment. The effect of this has been to replace a hard money economy with an inflationary credit economy. It is interesting to note that both paper money and limited liability became entrenched in the United States after the Civil War. Paper money is limited liability money. Gold and silver and 100% reserve banking and currency place estates and banking under unlimited liability. Significantly, banks in the US were among the first to make use of limited liability. The justification for the Lincoln greenbacks was quite an honest one. In his report of December 1861, Chase laid down his favourite principle that a paper circulation was a loan without interest made by the people, and that the government was fairly entitled to the profitable privilege. He followed this up by a clean statement from which he never wavered. That Congress, under its constitutional power to lay taxes, to regulate commerce, and to regulate the issue of coins, possesses ample authority to control the credit circulation. This is plain speaking, but not quite plain enough. Chase could have added that not only is paper money a loan without interest made by the people to the state, but it was also, ultimately, a loan without repayment. The issue of the Lincoln greenbacks produced a rise in the price of gold and a decline in the value of the greenbacks. On June the 16th, 1864, Chase wrote to Horace Greeley, "The price of gold must and shall come down, or I'll quit and let somebody else try." The next step by the Lincoln administration was to abolish the gold market altogether, having failed to control it. The bill prohibiting all contracts for the sale of gold for future delivery and the sale of gold by a gold broker outside his office had to be repealed as a failure almost at once. It is commonplace to blame the federal governments for the inflationary policies of the 20th centuries. The radical change in purchasing power scarcely needs documenting. In 1905, an excellent house of half-timbered construction cost only $1,000. The same house in 1968 would cost perhaps $40,000 to $60,000. But has this change been entirely, or even mainly, the fault of the federal government? Have not the people steadily voted in those who inflated most? When a business atmosphere is geared to limited liability, the business world competes to accumulate debt as a means of advantage for rapid expansion. In 1968, one major and somewhat conservative business corporation required an annual increase of $600 million in new credit or debt. And how is this kind of liability to be paid off? The answer is clearly by more inflation, by paying off good debts with bad money. On the whole, the commercial world is not conservative. It is geared to inflationary policies. Its expansion, growth, and survival require continuous inflation. Having felt secure by means of limited liability to contract debt irresponsibly, limited liability companies are therefore prone to take the next step to secure their limited liability from debts and responsibility by pushing for an unlimited money supply. In the process, business competes with state in a race towards an astronomical debt to be repaid with unlimited printing press money. The corporations, as they accumulate their debts, will cry socialism at the mounting federal debt. But socialism begins at home, and the significant and neglected step towards socialism was limited liability. The end of limited liability is unlimited money and unlimited disaster. Before there can be a hard money policy, there must be a hard and fast responsibility. The alternative to hard money is finally a hard dictator and disaster.